The morning I found the key, I already knew I was in trouble. It was sitting on the hallway floor, just inside my door. A brass key on a chain, with a small compass charm. I recognized the keychain before I recognized what the key was for. I stood there in socked feet in the early light, holding it, turning it over once, trying to construct a version of events in which this was not what it was. Then my phone rang. "That was on purpose," she said, before I could speak. Her voice was careful, not nervous, careful, like a woman who had made a decision and assembled the courage to stand behind it. I wanted you to know. It wasn't an accident." She hung up before I could answer. I stood in the middle of my kitchen for a long moment, holding a brass compass keychain, and for the first time in 8 months, I stopped pretending I didn't understand what was happening between us. My name is Daniel Marsh. I am 34 years old. I coordinate freight logistics for a mid-sized import company, which sounds like it should involve exotic locations and does not. My days involve spreadsheets, delayed containers, and a rotating cast of shipping agents who call it inconvenient hours. I live in a building I moved into 8 months ago, on the 4th floor, apartment 4B. I do not own a plant. I have one framed photograph on my wall, a shot from my cousin's wedding, and 4 years ago I promised myself I would hang more. I have not hung more. My sister says my apartment looks like a man who paused mid-move and never quite finished. She is not wrong. Her name is Nora Vance. She lives in 4A, directly across the hall. She has worked as a copy editor at a small publishing house for 7 years. She reads the way other people breathe, constantly, without apparent effort, in the specific way that tells you books are the place she is most honestly herself. She keeps a rotating stack of them beside her front door, the ones she has finished, the ones she is returning, the ones she borrowed 3 years ago and has stopped pretending she'll give back. She drinks her coffee black and slightly too hot. She listens to people with her entire face, not just her eyes, and the experience of being listened to by her makes you feel, for the duration of the conversation, as though whatever you are saying has been worth saying. She also has a brass compass keychain. She has carried it since before I knew her. She never explained it, and I never asked, which is how you treat things that feel like they belong to someone's private geography. We met on my 3rd day in the building. I was in the parking lot, pulling into spot 4, which my lease assigned to my apartment. She was standing beside a bicycle, looking at my car the way a person looks at a mild disaster they could see arriving from far away. "That is my spot," she said. "It's my spot," I said. "I have a lease. I have parked here for 18 months. Leases tend to outrank informal arrangements." She looked at me for one long second, the way she would later look at a manuscript where the author had made an interesting but ultimately wrong structural decision. Then she walked into the building without another word. 3 hours later, I found a handwritten note on my door. It said, "If you use the second spot from the left, it has better drainage. You'll thank me in November." And below that, in smaller, less certain writing, "Sorry about earlier. I'm better in writing than in person." I took the second spot from the left. She was right about the drainage. I thanked her in November. The night that changed the shape of everything was in February. The building was cold the way old buildings get cold. Not dramatically, just present. A low, persistent kind of cold that works its way into floors and makes coffee go lukewarm before you finish it. I had been home late from work, finishing a report, and around 11:30 I heard it. 3 quick knocks, then a pause, then one slow one. I opened my door. Nora was standing in the hallway in a coat she had clearly just pulled on over pajamas. Her hair was still up from whatever she had been doing before everything went wrong. She was holding her phone, looking at it with the expression of a woman who has just discovered that her building's emergency maintenance line is more aspirational than functional. "My key snapped in the lock," she said. "The building's after-hours line has me on a 3-hour hold. Is it possible you own a?" She stopped. She looked at me properly for the first time. "You don't look like a man who owns a toolkit." "I own a toolkit," I said. "You look like a man who owns a toolkit that came pre-assembled in a gift box." "That is accurate," I said. "It was from my brother. Come in." She stood in my kitchen while I located the toolkit, which had in fact arrived in a very cheerful gift box with a bow. The apartment felt different with her in it. Not smaller, just more accounted for. She kept her coat on and looked at the one framed photograph on my wall, the way she looked at titles she was making up her mind about. "Your sister?" she asked. "Cousin," I said. "The apartment looks like you stopped mid-move." "I keep hearing that." I fixed the lock in 20 minutes, 2 strip screws, and one moment where I dropped the screwdriver cleanly onto my own foot and said something that made her press her hand over her mouth to stop from laughing. When the door opened cleanly, she tested it twice. Then she turned and looked at me and said, "Thank you." Quiet. Not in the way she said things conversationally, in the way she said things she meant, where the word carried more weight than its letters could explain. I walked back to my apartment. I stood in the kitchen. I told myself the room felt different because of the cold. I have poor survival instincts around women who say things quietly and mean them. After that, things did not change dramatically. They changed the way February changes into March, gradually, without announcement, in ways you only notice after the fact. She started leaving coffee outside my door on mornings I left early. Not every morning, and without a note, just a paper cup from the place 2 streets down that opened at 6, black. Slightly too hot. I started leaving the stairwell door propped on evenings I heard her key in the lock at the same time I was coming in. Neither of us mentioned any of it. I told myself this was just how neighbors behaved when they had established a working arrangement. I was not rigorously examining that theory. Then her sister came for a weekend in March, and the theory took some damage. Her sister was nothing like Nora. Louder, faster to smile, the kind of person who asked you questions about yourself and waited with visible delight for the answers. We ran into each other at the mailboxes on Saturday morning. She introduced herself, then tilted her head and said, "Oh, you're 4B. The way she said it was not informational. "Nora's mentioned you," her sister added, smiling in the way people smile when they are choosing to leave a sentence technically incomplete. Nora appeared at the end of the hallway at that exact moment, looked at her sister, and said her name in a specific tone, the one people use when they have identified a problem and are about to manage it. Her sister said, pleasantly, "I was just saying that Nora mentioned you fixed her lock." She was very grateful. Nora said, "The mailboxes are over here," and steered her sister firmly in the other direction. I stood at the mailboxes for longer than the task required. That had not been about the lock. The book came in April. She had mentioned the same novel 3 times without technically recommending it, once in passing, once offhandedly. And then a paperback appeared on the small table outside her door, with a post-it that said "for whenever." I read it in 4 days because I could not stop. When I knocked to return it, she opened the door before I had finished knocking, which meant she had heard my footsteps and known who it was. "You read it quickly," she said. "I couldn't stop," I said. She held my gaze for 1 second longer than felt safe. Then she took the book and said, "There's a second one." but only if the ending worked for you. The ending worked for me, I said. She went still, just slightly, like a woman who had prepared for a different answer and had to quietly reorganize around a better one. The second book arrived outside my door the following morning. I found out about the contact name by accident, which is how I tend to find out about things I wasn't meant to find out. She was looking up a restaurant, and her phone slid off the counter. And when I picked it up to hand back, the screen was still lit, the recent calls, my name in the list. It said, Daniel, H-I-A-D-S, 4B. She reached for the phone too quickly. I handed it back without saying anything. The moment sat between us, slightly too long, slightly too warm, both of us choosing not to name it. I thought about it for 3 days. I told myself 4B was practical, that she probably listed everyone by unit number, that I was a logistics coordinator who owned one framed photograph and a gifted toolkit, and had no business turning a contact label into evidence. I was not convincing either of us. The dry run before the key was a Thursday evening in May. We had both ended up in the hallway at the same time. She was locking up, I was arriving, and we stood talking for a while about nothing in particular. The building. The neighbor on the 3rd floor who rearranged furniture at 10 p.m., and whose internal logic remained entirely his own. The coffee shop down the street, which had changed to thinner cups, and she had opinions about it that were more developed than the situation probably warranted. She was leaning in the doorframe of her apartment, arms loosely crossed, and she was laughing, really laughing, not politely, the kind that came out faster than intended. And then she stopped, and she looked at me. I looked back. The hallway was quiet. The light overhead did its thing, that warm, slightly inconsistent flicker it had been performing for months, that building maintenance had added to a list they were not in a hurry about. Her compass keychain was in her hand, the way she always held it when she was standing still and thinking. She said, "This is a weird building." "It is," I said. "I like it anyway." She was not talking about the building. I was 90% certain she was not talking about the building. I was also not prepared to be wrong about that particular 90%, so I said nothing of substance. She said good night and went inside. I stood in the hallway for an amount of time a reasonable man would not have stood there. My domestic habits are becoming genuinely threatening. The key appeared on a Saturday morning, in June. I was still half asleep when I heard the sound, the small, careful slide of metal on hardwood just inside the door. I found it when I got up. Brass, compass charm. Sitting on the floor as though it had arrived quietly and was waiting for me to catch up. I picked it up. I stood there. I understood, in a way that bypassed argument and landed somewhere below the chest, exactly what it was and what it meant. She had made a copy of her spare key. She had slipped it under my door sometime before I was awake, which meant she had been standing on the other side of this door this morning, which meant she had made a decision and walked toward it before the part of her that would second-guess it could arrive in time. My phone rang. "That was on purpose," she said. Her voice was careful, not guarded. Careful. Guarded is armor you put on. This sounded like something she had taken off. "Okay," I said. "I didn't want you to think it was a mistake, or that I did it without thinking. I wanted you to know it was intentional." A pause, small and held. "It's yours, if you want it." She hung up. I held the phone for a moment. Then I held the key. Then I put my shoes on and walked across the hall and knocked on her door. She answered it in the same coat from February, the one she had pulled on over pajamas the night her key broke in the lock. I recognized it the way you recognize the beginning of something when you are finally looking back at it honestly. She was holding her phone and not quite looking at me. "You didn't have to come over," she said. "I know," I said. She looked up. "You can have it back," I said. "I'm not going to make this strange. We can go get coffee, and this can just be a Saturday morning." She looked at me the way she had looked at that first book cover, like she was deciding whether the ending was worth the weight of the beginning. "I don't want it back," she said. Something in my chest shifted. Quietly, the way things settle when they were always meant to be where they land, I said, "I've kept that parking spot. The second one from the left. Better drainage," you said. "I have been in this building 8 months, and it has never once occurred to me to use a different one." She waited. "I'm not talking about the spot," I said. She laughed once, the real one, the fast one, and then it was quiet, and she stepped back from the door, and I walked through into her apartment. The door closed behind me. She was standing in the middle of her kitchen, and when she turned I crossed the room, and when I touched her face, she was very still and she was looking at me, and when I kissed her, it was the kind of kiss you give someone you have been trying not to know you love for longer than you meant to. The neighbor on the floor below knocked on his ceiling, which in this building meant he was rearranging furniture again, at an hour and for reasons that remained entirely his own. We both stopped. She pressed her forehead against my shoulder and laughed, and the room held that sound like it had been waiting for it, and I thought, this is what it feels like when something stops pretending to be smaller than it is. Months later, her spare key lived on my keychain beside my own. She held it up one afternoon, turning it over in her hand, and said, "I thought about doing it for weeks before I did, whether it was too much, whether you'd come over or just text." "What did you think I would do?" I said. "I thought you would knock," she said. "I was hoping you would knock." I told her I had been keeping the parking spot for 8 months and returning a book I read in 4 days and hearing her name come up on calls and discovering I had to actively choose not to mention her afterward, and that it was entirely possible I had known for longer than I would like to account for, and had simply been engaged in a sustained and increasingly unconvincing act of willful misidentification. She said, "You stayed for the drainage." "I stayed for you," I said. She looked away. She was smiling. The compass keychain was on the counter between us. She had always carried it, and she had never explained it, and I had never asked. Because some things you wait to learn the natural way. When the person decides you've earned the story. Years later, when people asked how we got together, she would say, "He fixed my lock in February, in the cold, with a toolkit someone else bought him. He dropped the screwdriver on his own foot. I liked him before I was ready to like him." I would say, "She was right about the drainage. She was right about most things." She left a key under my door and called to make sure I knew it wasn't an accident, and she would look at me the way she looked at endings that had earned themselves. And that was the whole story, sitting quietly in a look, the way important things tend to. Nothing about us had appeared overnight. It had simply stopped hiding. What would you have done if your neighbor slipped their spare key under your door and called to say it was on purpose? And have you ever stayed close to someone, telling yourself it was just habit, just proximity, when you already knew it was something more? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one found you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.